And I'm also thrilled that we're here with Linwood Lewis, who is, we were just talking before all of you got in. Linwood was selected by the graduating seniors as their choice of a professor who they wanted to speak during their senior week. It's a tradition that started in 1989. Some of you were here for that. And his work is very exciting and wonderful, and I could describe it, but I think I would much rather have Linwood do it. But the one thing I will tell you that I learned in going to the senior lecture that is not immediately apparent is that Linwood is a phenomenal ultimate frisbee player.
Oh.
And has competed in that sport for many, many years with some great success. So in addition to being very academic and intellectual, he's also of sound mind and body.
Thank you. Oh boy. Get nice introduction. Always get kind of, who is that person that you're talking about? I think that, first of all, this is, really a wonderful idea of providing the opportunity for you guys to come back and, sort of take the seminar again, and I'm glad that you picked this one. This is a class that I've taught for many years now, and I see it as a culmination of my interest in a lot of different areas, and a way of explaining how to make sense of a complex social world that in many ways doesn't make sense. I grew up in a housing project about 5 miles from here, a lot of the questions that came to me around identity, how do I make my way through a world as a African American and African Caribbean man, an intellectual, an athlete, and a working class kid. And this work around intersectionality helped me to make sense of my multiple identities. And so that's how I come to this work. And I don't know if you all have, you guys, did we have class together?
I don't think so, but I graduated in 2006, so my fiance is 04, so it's this year,
yeah.
but
So, yeah. So, I mean, and what year did you graduate?
I'm one of those reprobates that did graduate from ceremonies, but I spent time here in 2008. What year? I was here in 90. I was supposed to be class of 94. It's just all a blur.
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
So you got, I got here in 1997. Okay, so you guys are familiar. I've seen you on campus before, but so I teach classes in race and ethnicity, in human sexuality, in health, in masculinities, psychology plays a lot of different things. And when people think about, well, how do those things all connect? How do you make sense of them? What is the underlying is there an underlying theoretical and intellectual thread that connects through them? And this work in intersectionality is quite a bit part of it. But this is very abstract, and I think that this is a very useful concept at the level of people working in the world. And so that's kind of the level I'd like to dip between this more theory stuff and how does it make sense in making sense of things. So before I go into any of that, I'd like to get to know you guys a little bit more, and you get to know each other a little bit more, and we'll go from there. So is ceremony. So anytime I'm too vague or I go, what?
Good to be back.
Yeah, you guys stand on ceremony. What are you talking about? I love those questions. So let's start with you guys telling us a little bit about yourselves. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. Getting to know you. About you. Okay. My name is Willow Chang. I have a new last name. If I'd known it was such a pain in the ass to change it, I would have just kept it. So Willow Chang Elion, but most people know me as Willow Chang. I was born and raised in Hawaii. Hawaii is its own interesting little microcosm of mixed ethnicities and shared history and what I call plantation mentality, which I'm on a one-woman campaign to assert that this is the social and emotional plague that really troubles Hawaii in terms of identity, and it's very rarely talked about because culturally people just don't talk about those things. But because you have, for lack of better, we'll call cultural colonization, missionary aspects, the whole plantation of various people brought to work the islands, and this social structure, even though it may not be in place in its past form, I feel like that those memories still linger, and the way that people interact with each other are so attributed to that. And I feel like Cassandra. People think I'm just a nutbag. Like, what you talking about, girl? Like, you can get a job at the Gap, and it's like you don't understand. Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm also of mixed ancestry. My mother was of German and English background, with a smidge of American Indian, which I found out our tribe was obliterated. They were, the internet's really great. It's like, wow. And then my dad is a first generation American of Chinese descent, and so his parents came over. But the big, I think, difference for his upbringing was that they were merchant class. I know this sounds like so ridiculous, but it's so they were merchants instead of working the land, and he was the youngest of 13, and he went to Harvard, and everybody laughed their butt that he was going to go to Harvard, and he did. And I think a lot of those social structures within our own personal mythology of my family certainly contributed to my wanting to break boundaries and just go for it and just have no shame, because I just understood that from a very young age, my just existence would rub people the wrong way. So even though there's a lot of people of mixed parentage being Hapa, as we call it, Hapa meaning half, more or less, in Hawaiian, I just figured, like, might as well let your free flag fly. I mean, there's no point in trying to convince somebody that you're a good person when you are, even though I've spent a lot of my life trying to do just that. Gosh, where am I going with this? I teach dance and music. I'm a facilitator in the arts and an advocate and produce events. Surprise. I have a web show that just started almost a year ago, which I love. I'm in the process of trying to catalog every bon vivant that lives in Hawaii and makes it an interesting and dynamic place. I get my best ideas when I'm shaving my legs. Whatever that means.
It's a good thing it's warm all year round.
Yeah, I work in the realm of dance, which I guess a lot of people would call cultural dance forms. I started off with Hawaiian hula, and that was a very life-changing experience simply because my kuma, which was my hula teacher, her halau was called halau orama olipua. So that's the school of indigenous flowers, and she had expressed to us that she defined maoli, even though it's in a traditional term, something that's indigenous. She said that if you're a person of Hawaii, that you're indigenous. She never defined it in terms of your racial background, and I think that that's so essential because right now, as Hawaii goes through these issues with the sovereignty movement and issues of identity, which kind of run the spectrum from discussion to just anger. I think it's important that inclusion, because there are many parts and facets of the Hawaiian culture that always involved inclusion, whether it was like third gender or having someone hanai or adopted into your family that wasn't a blood. And I realized as an adult, looking back on this experience of being in the halau, that it was the one singular environment where it was kind of a meritocracy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my progress was charted based on the work that I did, or my performance as a student, or my attention as a student, as opposed to my skin. And I really took refuge in that environment because of that. So my parents sent me to Chinese school after regular school. I go to Chinese school. It was daycare. It was hell. It was horrible because being biracial was just like, it was never half full. It was always half empty. Blah, blah, blah. I teach Middle Eastern dance. That opened up a whole can of worms because I don't have delusions that I'm of Middle Eastern descent, even though I relate to many parts of that culture and I feel an affinity with it. And so now that we're discussing all these identity issues in Hawaii, it's like, well, where do you put somebody who is of mixed ancestry, who is interested in does, Middle Eastern dance and Indian dance forms, and, I just call myself everybody's daughter, and I don't think there should be an issue with that, but I respect that identity is very fluid, and you still should always try to respect the cultures that you are intending to study or celebrate. So it's always a tightrope, right? So I'm just going to leave it there because otherwise I'll be here all day. And then furthermore,
there's so many things that, so many different directions that, one could go. I see so many parallels between what, you were just talking about and what, I think about and talk about in this work.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Thank you. That's why when I had a horse shaft, I was like, ooh, ooh, ooh. You're like, how did you take that?
So, who's next?
I'll go. I'm Adrian.
We don't have to do the clock thing.
Yeah, pass the stick. I'm Adrian. I'm graduating of 4. And I actually sat in when we had, I don't know the name of this event, we had like diversity talk when there was a big on-campus issue and they just sort of shut it down.
Oh, yeah.
I came to your class and I don't remember anything about it, but other than it was fantastic.
Yeah.
And another line I would have been in your program because I was completely in the arts and just still am, obsessed with that, but I was just so taken by that. But I live in Austin, Texas, and I work in part in social services. I work for a nonprofit agency that does counseling and education. And we serve the city of Austin is changing a lot. A lot of gentrification happening. So housing has become a huge crisis for, and the clients we primarily serve are youth and families that are in crisis, and a lot of youth that have aged out of foster care. So that's kind of our population with a lot of intersecting issues depending on the foster care status. But when I was reading the articles, like the status of if you were with your biological family or not is also such a huge identity break, you know what I mean, between the kids who are always with their biological families or some member of the biological family versus foster care, and a lot of those youth are just completely on their own. So that's what that made me think of. So I do that in part, and then I work in the arts. I'm a playwright, and I work for a theater company. And one of the plays I'm working on is about Leo Felton, who is a mixed race background who plotted to bomb the, I forget what it is, New England Holocaust Memorial in 2001. And he's been passing as a white man, and his parents, he's of mixed race, his parents were civil rights activists. Like, he's a crazy, crazy story. So the play that I'm working on is a lot about fluid identity and passing in and out of these different timepieces. So this is all very much something I'm interested in.
And what was Leo's last name?
Leo Felton. Felton. His name. Yeah. Yeah. His story without anything on it is fascinating.
Yeah.
And he's still around. He's in prison, obviously, for many years. But he's done a complete turnaround from he started getting into the white power groups as a skinhead, just non-racist skinhead, and then got in trouble with the law, and then started in prison passing as white. And then when he was released, he got picked up on a counterfeit thing that sent him back to prison. His identity was revealed, and now he's come around, sees himself as being beige. He's come to accept this other identity, and so that's now what he's in prison in a world that's completely white or black. So he's in a really weird spot in his life. But yeah, anyway, that's.
Have you actually met with him?
I've actually, we're pen pals. It's terrifying. He scares me quite a lot. But it's just an opportunity. I mean, like this, where when you have an opportunity to tell your story, you have, and his story he really feels has been taken away from him because the media just grabbed it and ran with it. And he's like, that wasn't my, like, I have my story to tell, and they told this other thing, you know. And I mean, I think definitely mental illness is, you know, part of his environment. But you know, I do empathize with that, like your narrative sort of being told by someone else, and those points where it's like, that's not actually what happened, and that's not exactly what I felt, you know, because he had a really strong bond with both of his parents. Just a lot of my play is trying to figure out, like, how did this happen? How you know, how did this guy come to? He could have hurt a lot of people, and he didn't. He maintains he never would have bombed anyone. He just wanted to see if he could build a bomb. That was what he says. But he had all the steps kind of planned. He said, you know, he thought that was going to be the last year of his life, and he and his girlfriend were all primed to set off this spiritual holy war, and he saw himself as a leader of that, you know, just completely insane.
I mean, that's really, it's fascinating how, you know, on so many levels, when I think about how, in a present context, media and the speed in which media works, and also the access, you know, to aspects of people's lives that may not have existed in the past. You know, media has always, you know, it's been there, you know, through much of the 20th century, blah, blah, blah. But that, you know, the speed in which your narrative, you know, doesn't become your narrative anymore, you know, and the amount of evidence that people can use to tell a story in a different way, to change, to weave a narrative that serves their needs. You know, think about this guy.
Billy Rogers' manifesto.
Well, that's it. But now what I was thinking more about, you know, the POW that just got released. You know, I mean, and you know, with Bradley, what's his name? Bradley Beal? No. Beal? I think. Yeah.
Bergdahl. Something Bergdahl.
Oh yeah, the Bergdahl. There we go. Yeah. And how you know, his narrative becomes, you know, and the speed in which it gets changed around, and how intersectional tropes get laid on top of, you know, who you are and how you are seen by other people. It's fascinating in a way. You know, you think about a train wreck, or you know, and the speed in which narratives can turn. You know, 2 weeks ago, prominent GOP, you know, senators and what have you were yelling, you know, gotta get this guy out, gotta get this guy out. And then, you know, a month later, you know, and all the evidence is there, you know, of this, you know, switch, and how, and he's sort of a cipher, you know, people aren't really talking to him at all, you know, it's not, you know, fascinating, not good, what it is.
Well, they look at his father too, trying to understand what's going on there.
Well, I mean, he, you know, he's got a beard.
He speaks Pashtun. I mean, I gotta give the guy credit.
Right.
He learned Pashtun.
He learned, right?
Wow.
You know, and you know, and how, you know, his beard, you know, as part of you know, how he was expressing his solidarity with his son being in prison you know, for 5 years, and then how, you know, people go boom, you know, and they take another, you know, narrative laid on top of it, and his face becomes something, you know, and his beard becomes something that, you know, was so far away from his intentions.
Oh, we make up so many stories.
Yeah.
And when are we creating people to be strong men for the, you know, for our own agendas, especially in a political context?
Right. Yeah. And then I find that that's I find that that's the way it is, you know, in most contexts also, that, you know, it's like you take the story, you know, you take someone else's narrative, but you remember the parts, or you use the parts that make sense for you in terms of you know, creating your own space. Funny thing is, I think that for some of those folks, they're entirely, you know, folks who are kind of have switched their narrative very quickly, for them, I think some of them, I think they believe the story that they're telling, which is sad.
Scary sometimes.
It is. So much stuff. Yeah. Thanks. Who's next?
I can go next. My name is Laura Madsen. I graduated in 2006. My fiance was 04, so I'm interloping on the 10-year reunions, which is great because a lot of my friends are from that time. I live in Minneapolis. I just finished law school a few weeks ago, studying for the bar exam, but I'm also doing a PhD in geography.
Oh, cool.
Geography, environment, and society at the University of Minnesota. And so my research has kind of gone to other crazy places, but what I'm working on right now is I took sort of serendipitously took a tribal courts class with this incredible professor named John Burroughs. He's a Canadian Indigenous law scholar. And he had a huge impact on me, and so I was sort of looking around. I wanted to apply for funding, and I was looking around for a case that I would be really excited about. I'd done mostly international law and human rights stuff. And I found this case at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights that was a Canadian group from Vancouver Island that had been using these international courts to file claims against the Canadian state. So I contacted him and said, do you know anybody? And he was like, oh yeah, of course, I know everybody. I know everyone's working on this. So I applied for funding to go out and do research on this case and received it, and so spent last summer on Vancouver Island. And so this group that I've been working with, they're called the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group, and in 1884, the governments of Canada and British Columbia sort of colluded to deed the majority of their traditional territory to a coal baron who had been active in building the railroad across Canada. And British Columbia is different from a lot of Canada and a lot of the U.S. in that there just weren't many treaties signed with Indigenous groups. They just sort of said, oh, this is ours, tough luck. So now, in 1993, they started a treaty commission in British Columbia to retroactively negotiate treaties. And the sort of like feel-good reason is that they want to make it right, but the other reason is that they want title to be certain.
Right.
They want the non-Indigenous people who are buying land to know that their land's not going to be litigated over and taken away in the court system. So that's going on, and it's been a kind of mess, the treaty process. So this group started their treaty claim in '93. It just kept going, and then finally in 2007 they were like, this sucks, we're going to the international court system, and filed this claim. So they work with this Indigenous law and critical race theory scholar out of the University of Arizona named Rob Williams. So I've been working with Rob really closely on a bunch of different projects. And so the process of doing this sort of legal geography and just happening to meet John Burroughs and get to know all these people has completely shaped what I'm working on. So now I'm doing all this research, and I've done some work with like writing best practices for conservation organizations. That there's a couple big ones that have gotten in trouble for sort of accidentally removing Indigenous peoples from land that they want to conserve. I mean, really big ones. And so that's obviously not good for their reputation. So they came to Rob and said, can you write these best practices? And he pulled me into that. So we've been doing a lot of that work, which is really exciting. And then now I'm starting to work on, in Minnesota there are a lot of tribes that have been doing very well, and some that are very poor and having a hard time. But it's interesting to see the dynamics of state politics change around the kind of, I guess, lack of a better term, the kind of purchasing power that tribal entities have. So
that's what I was thinking about when you were talking about what was going on in Vancouver. And sort of the building of new treaties, that didn't exist before. And in the U.S., when you look at folks who claim an Indigenous identity, there are so many different ways that occurs. For some people, it's they've been living within a community, and they're a part of that community. For other people, it may come more as a question of, well, I found this out about my ancestry. And then it's a claim that comes later, and sometimes it can be done in a way that's authentic to the self, but in other ways it can be done as a way of participating within the social structures that have been created in place to deal with, practices that have been, bad in the past.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, and that's been a really fascinating thing about looking comparatively at the U.S. and Canada, because their relationship as states and then the kind of sub-state, states in the U.S. and provinces in Canada are very different in terms of how they interact with Indigenous peoples, and it's really fascinating to take, because in so many, if you look at like the broad world scale, there are so many similarities, but to kind of pick apart these little nuances has been really fascinating. And then the thing, I'm trying to, now I've kind of got the legal stuff, you can always learn a lot more, but I'm more comfortable in that realm, and I'm trying to sort of root my project theoretically. And so, that's how I came to critical race theory and intersectionality as it developed in legal scholarship. And then took this geography. Geography is kind of like wacky, lefty, all kinds of like cool critical theory stuff happening. So now there's this talk I took, Geographies of Race and Sexuality class last year.
Cool.
And there's a lot of talk about like, is intersectionality enough now? Does it, delineate people in two fine categories? There's Deleuze-Guattari assemblages. Have you agreed with this?
But I don't mean about that, but that was I just taught this class last semester, and that was one of the things that we came to near the end of it. It's like, when you start to, look with too fine a lens, using metaphors, but what have you, we are, all of us are the intersections of so many different possible identities that, then it becomes, well, how do you make sense of, a African-American, Afro-Caribbean, transgender person who, trans man who's in a relationship with a, a Irish white, man, cis man, and, how do you make sense of and, one of the ways that we started to think about how to make sense of that is to deal with issues of salience and context. And when I think about geographies of place, the place that you're in, as you move from place to place, the salience of different identities becomes different.
Well, it's interesting too, thinking about Indigenous peoples, because there's sort of a racial component, but in the U.S., it's, at least in the kind of the way that we conceptualize it legally, it's a political division. And that's how the Supreme Court is framed, which is like a whole weird thing. Like of course, like why do we have to minimize the racial aspect? I mean, it's important, even though it's not everything. But so then in Canada, this is the thing that I've sort of struggled with in trying to figure out how to theoretically talk about this, because I'm doing like reading about the racial state and all these things. But in Canada, they don't want to talk about racism. Like people think that racism is an American problem. It's so funny, and I hear people. I'm obviously a white woman. Other white people will say like the most racist shit about Indigenous peoples in front of me, but then they're like, "Oh no, racism, that's American," and I'm like, "No, it's not." But why? And so I've been thinking about like how we deal with speech, right? And I was talking to a Canadian friend of mine who's a lawyer and an Indian woman, and she was like, in Canada we criminalize hate speech, and I love that. Like Americans are so into this freedom of speech thing, but I love that we don't have freedom of speech when speech is hateful, and so I've been kind of struggling with that and thinking like, yeah, but we're having like a really open discussion about racism and sexism because people feel like they can say horrible stuff and then someone can respond to it.
Right, because you have the freedom to say what you want to say, but not the freedom to avoid the consequences of it.
Precisely.
Right.
Yeah.
And
so
so there's openness in talking about. Also, even in the business of the racial project business, since our inception explicitly, and other countries have been doing so, explicitly, but also implicitly, and are not holding that. When I think about British scholarship around race, I think that one of the strengths is that they deal with issues of colonialism, which the United States does not, because our colonial tradition, we tend to see it theoretically from the other side, that we were a colony, not that we are colonized. colonizers. And so it speaks to some of the issues that you were talking about in terms of plantation mentality. And so they're really good at that, but what they're not so good at is looking at race as a construct in all its manifestations. And I think that Canada shares that.
Yeah. Well, Canada, the Prime Minister said recently that Canada is one of the only countries that has never had a colonial history, and it's like, what? Canada still has. North America is still settler colonial societies. How can we? It's just such a tremendous leap to believe that it's never.
Right. It's kind of
crazy.
It's interesting. You're right. Canada is kind of like a hybrid. Because both the U.S. and Canada, had this westward push, and then colonized and decimated. The indigenous folks.
Yeah.
It's like
exactly. I'm thinking about my own position as a researcher. My family's Norwegian, and they came out and they settled in Minnesota when the Dakota Territories were still the Dakota Territories, and they were a part of this colonization, and very actively. And Minnesota has a rife history with indigenous peoples. So I think intersectionality, one thing that draws me to the theory is that it's helpful. It's helpful for understanding kind of broad political, racial concepts, but it's also helpful in positioning yourself as a researcher and as someone who's interested in these issues. And how do you? Because obviously, objectivity. To me, obviously, objectivity is not a helpful frame. It's not a helpful starting point when you're doing research.
Right.
It's the notion of objectivity. I'm clearly subjective.
Right.
My life is based on my experiences. So, how do I just be honest about that enough that it doesn't impact my research in a negative way?
It's interesting when people talk about intersectionality. In the past, they've talked about it as intersection of multiple identities that are subjugated. And we don't talk so much about intersections of identities that are seen as majority. Like whiteness. And I think that it would actually be helpful in having a clear understanding of how all issues of identity and privilege and what have you work, if people were to keep in mind that majority identities are also constructed, and not use the intersectional frame to in fact deflect the idea of interrogating these identities. So, let me be explicit about it. Sometimes when I'm talking to students who self-identify as white, particularly men, they'll say things like, well, and I talk about the idea of privilege. They'll say, Linwood, you're talking about white privilege, and you say that, well, I get this, and this from being white. But, I'm a poor guy. My family grew up in Appalachia. So, I don't have any of those, those benefits. And so, therefore, what you're saying is nonsense. They don't go that far.
My husband does.
Yeah.
He's from France, and we have this discussion, because we grew up in the French ghetto, and it's like, we have this discussion almost weekly. It's like, the guys in the ghetto. Go on, sorry.
Well,
Because I'm like,
yeah, and it's like, yes, you may have grown up in a place that, where, or within a social class that is, does not experience these kinds of privilege, but, that doesn't mean that it negates the other aspects of the self. What it does, it transforms it, so that you can talk about it and say, I'm going to resist, the idea of white privilege or male privilege by evoking my, the way, my sexual minority status, and it's like, and it's I find it very strongly, it's a point of resistance, but also, a point of entree. But you can't think about it as a point of entry that, it's the same exact experience. It's interesting, thing to
This is the last thing I'll say. I'm thinking about this notion of neutrality that comes across in a lot of legal language. Like if you're talking about negligence. Like, what would a reasonable, prudent person do? And of course, as the standards developed, what would a reasonable, prudent, middle-class white man
person.
with 2 kids, a wife, and a front yard do? You know. And I think that failing to investigate the nuances and complexities of majority identities and status insulates this concept of neutrality that then protects privileges because they're seen as like the norm. I mean, when Sandra Sotomayor was being having her Senate hearing, and they said, "Well, you know, you keep talking about how you're a wise Latina lady, like, well, that's going to bias you." And it's like, well, every white man that sits on the bench is biased by his own privilege. Like, why do we still today consider that as like a neutral, unbiased status? It's nuts. I just think it's crazy.
I mean, it's you know, when I think about stand your ground laws, you know, like, you know, even if, you know, let's say, you know, we know all the different problems that I hear, but, you know, when you know, let's say we're even talking about it within the context of the law itself, you know, it's, you know, when do you feel fear? You know, when is it reasonable for a person to feel fear? You know, and not taking into account one's social position in that field and privilege, the privilege of, well, you know, if someone plays music next to me and I don't like it, you know, that gives me the right to shoot them, you know, because any normal, you know, reasonable person would feel afraid of, you know, a group of African American young men playing music really loud right next to you in the convenience store parking lot. And how that is a reasonable law to have. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Tish, and I'm the class of 1964, and I haven't been back here in 20 years, so it's
Oh, wow. Oh, welcome back. Yeah.
I feel a little bit lost. And wow, I'm from California, from Oakland, and I picked this seminar because I didn't know what the word meant. And I thought there's something I, should learn here. My background is pretty much the white privileged one. I'm a lawyer. I worked in the environmental field for 20 years. I'm retired, and I've got a lot of grandchildren. And thinking I need to learn more about these ideas. I want to see what they're going to be doing in their lives, and want to be challenged myself. So I'm happy to be here.
Everybody.
So we're answering why we come to this class.
Yeah.
So my name is Julie. I'm in class of '89. I'm back here 15 years. My turn believe me. Excited to be here. I was drawn to come to this class because it sounded exactly like a Sarah Lawrence class I would take. I looked at the choice and like, that's the Sarah Lawrence class I'm looking for. Professionally, I'm a director and I also have a web startup. The director and producer project I'm working on right now is I just finished a show. I just finished a show for the Ms. Foundation about in honor of the 40th anniversary of their foundation. We did an interview with Gloria Steiner about the history of feminism, and that's out right now on Ms's website. And then I'm working on a show called The Future Starts Here, and it's like a thought piece show. We do 5-minute music video of ideas. So one of our episodes is going to be an episode on gender. One of our producers is a trans man, and he's, working on that episode with him right now, exploring kind of the current status of what that means. And putting it into a 5-minute piece. Exactly. The history of gender violence. but our last season, so this is season 2, so our last season did really well. It's, I think, kind of deal with different, kind of topics that are trending, I guess, trying to make them understandable to a broader audience.
Thanks.
Do you want me to say something?
Yeah, you get the play too.
Okay. Jody Abzug, I'm the Senior Director of the Fund for Sarah Lawrence and the Director of Parent Programs. I just celebrated my 3rd anniversary at Sarah Lawrence. I guess vis-a-vis this conversation, I think one of the things that's very interesting is my husband and I are a mixed religion couple. My children are, they've been raised with Catholic tenets and the Catholic sacraments. Let's get all the words right, Jody. And I'm culturally, and parts of my life have been very strongly Jewish. And for most of our lives, it really hasn't had a huge impact. However, my son is at a premier Catholic high school right now. And as I was explaining before, my husband and daughter live in Massachusetts. They're at a boarding school there. And my son and I are here. And so I'm the main parent. And so I find myself all the time at all these ceremonies or, just anything. And I literally am the only Jewish person in the room. So it's been very interesting to kind of see myself. I grew up in New York City, in one of the Queens towns, and so certainly my view of the world was that everybody was Jewish. So it was sort of horrifying to find out that wasn't true. No, it was wonderful to find out that wasn't true. But so it's just sort of interesting when you sort of think of yourself, because again, I guess I've sort of always thought, other than the fact that I'm a woman, I've sort of always thought of myself as somebody born of great privilege. But you sort of forget that in any context that can be shifted on its side. And I'm also here because Linwood's a fabulous professor.
Stop with that. I'm trying to lose myself in the conversation here. Thank you. So, let's see. The way I usually start this class, and classes, where I'm in all my classes is really to start with, very simple questions that get very complex very quickly. So in my sex class, I ask students, what is sex? And that seems like it's really a simple question. But when you start to ask yourself, what is it? How do we know it is what it is, whatever the concept we're talking about? That you start to unpack these very clear very clear set of givens that don't have any connection to anything. They're more of a received view about how to see the world. And as we start to unpack it, we see, well, that thing that I'm saying, I don't really believe in, And also, it interferes with a clearer understanding of what, that thing is. Intersectionality is a little weird because that's such a, as you were saying, because it's such a, it's a word that, knows what it means, in some ways, And so, one of the reasons why I signed that article was that even though, I didn't know whether any of you would have any interest in public health at all, that I thought that it was a very clear and useful explanation of not only what intersectionality was, but also how you could use it in the world, which is actually what I'm interested in. I'm not a philosopher, I'm a psychologist, sometimes. I don't really think of myself as a psychologist anymore. I think of myself as a person who likes to answer questions. And to answer questions in a way that's very concrete, both theoretical but also concrete. And so, let's start with this question. First of all, just like in a lot of zero arts classes, you can't really assume that folks, did the reading.
I didn't actually get the reading.
You know? Okay.
I never got that email.
Okay. So, but you guys are not, students anymore. So I don't have that expectation that you actually, because we're all busy professionals and doing stuff in the world and stuff like that, and so may not have that time. But so if there really is no, I just wanted to know if people had had a chance. So you had, Julie.
Yeah.
Okay. You did?
Yeah.
Okay.
I read it.
Okay.
I skimmed it.
Skimmed it. No, that's cool. You can say that and not feel bad at all.
I still have that shame. I'm like,
I intently read the first 3 pages.
Yeah. Well, that's it got kind of dense. Okay, and you didn't at all because you didn't get it.
I signed up yesterday.
Yeah, there you go.
I said I can do it.
Not a clue.
Not a clue.
I
So-
couldn't hear in the other room, so I thought I'd try this one.
So, why don't you guys lay out what you got from it, those of you who had a chance to read it, and then, we can sort of expand it so that everybody is on the same page. So, what is this idea of intersectionality?
But I can express this very eloquently. It made me think of a framework to break down, kind of like you were saying, to break down these larger exclusionary issues that exist in society and be able to see where these points intersect, obviously, that might help us have a better idea of what are the underlying issues, because an issue of, and looping minority as one term really not being an accurate way of looping, well, minority means a lot of things, and being able to see where these other race, gender, socioeconomic status,
It's kind of it's like a verbal representation of a Venn diagram is what I thought of intersectionality.
Yeah.
So it's like finding where those areas overlap, but with the understanding that you still retain the original identity of where so even if they overlap, they're not exclusive to each other. It's like that when people say, "Oh, there's smoke, there must be fire." It's like not always. You can have smoke and maybe, I don't know, can you have smoke and there's no fire? That's a good question.
That's a cool one. Yes, I think that this is a good place to start, but at the end you have to let this go. You got to let this Venn diagram go. And the reason why is because this part, it doesn't exist. Not really. The part that is separate, like, let's say this is sexuality, race, and gender. Okay? None of us are, just a man, or just Hawaiian, or just, bisexual. We're not, we don't just live one aspect of our identity. All of these parts of us occur always in the context of the other. And so one's experience of gender is invariably, seen through a lens of sexuality and race and social class, religion, and it transforms our experience of that gender status. So, intersectionality is actually, I think, a more accurate representation of how we actually live in the world. And so, what intersectionality is it is the expression of the idea that we have to look at these connections between multiple identities. That's how I would explain it if someone were to come up to me and just wanted a quick explanation. I would say intersectionality is a method of understanding, how we experience multiple aspects of ourselves, all at once.
I think it's also to think about like that the space outside of the convergences.
Mm-hmm.
Like the idea that there is a state of maleness is also kind of false. Like what it means to be male is produced by the people that are experiencing maleness through all of those
Absolutely.
multiple
Constructs, yeah.
construct, and then presenting that, and constructing a discourse about what bisexualism or whiteness is. It's not an objective state of being.
Right. But we can, talk about these things and how they work, as individual aspects of the self. It does make sense, and it is coherent as an area of study, as a way of understanding aspects of the self. But we always have to think about, those explorations as having open and porous boundaries. That there are always things that are connected to that we haven't looked at yet. So that our understanding is always contingent of gender or of race or of sexuality.
What's the one on the top?
This race.
I can't read the word.
Oh, sorry, race. It's race.
Oh.
Yeah. This was the abbreviation of sexuality. So when I teach a class on race, for example, okay, I start out with a discussion of the history of the construction of race. I talk about it. People think about it as being something that's always and forever. It's only was it 500 years old? And I talk about it as being an intellectual technology, meaning that it was something that was in fact created for a purpose. It's a technology that was created for a purpose, like this iPad or a radio or what have you, and changes over time. So that it's not the same. When people are talking about it in the 17th century, and they're talking about it in the 19th century or the 21st century. And that understanding it as something that is abstract, yet is constructed and reconstructed over time is an important idea. But also, as we go on in the class, I have to bring in other aspects of the self, because in fact, when you look at how race is built, as an example, part of the way in which it's built is it's built on ideas of sexuality and gender. That's one of the ways in which we come to understand the idea of race. We understand it because we bring in elements of gender and of sexuality and of social class. So if I were going to talk about a more theoretical way of describing this, I would talk about it as an exploration of mutually constitutive relations between social identities. Okay. So what I mean by mutually constitutive is that we're talking about two identities, or two social identities, that they build themselves, they build each other. So we think about sexuality and gender, for example. Okay, that's like probably one of the easiest examples. How do we define heterosexuality?
Someone who's attracted to the opposite sex, no? Hetero, means other.
But is that self-defined or is that societally defined?
What's
So
the question?
I see someone.
Like,
I
what's
see
the
someone-
problem?
I see someone, a woman is married to a man, but the man's actually bisexual. But if he's married to a woman,
Mhm.
he's not told me he's bisexual, and he's not identified that to my.
Mhm.
So my assumption of him is heterosexuality, but he could not be heterosexual.
Right.
And there's also, presumption of sex and gender in there, so,
That's,
you
yes.
know, if your sex does not conform to your gender,
Mhm.
then what is your sexuality in terms of, hetero, homo, bi?
Yeah, yeah.
Trans,
So-
yeah.
Trans. So, in fact, so this is, part of looking at this, we were just talking about sexuality, we would have to start to look at, these are some of the things that I would, these arrows are representing those aspects of understanding sexuality that have to come from other places, other disciplines, other identities, first of all. Secondly, the way I got to this was that I was saying that these things are mutually constitutive. So if you're looking at the definition of heterosexuality, you need, if this is sexuality, for you to understand sexuality in this context, you need gender. You need it. It's implicit in the definition. You can't define this without gender. Try.
But you can without race.
It only appears that way.
Prove it.
I like that.
But if you're a trans man married to a trans man married to a woman would be heterosexual, or not? Does heterosexuality necessitate that you are not trans? Or that
But
your
trans-
partner
but-
is not trans?
But transness, and how it complicates aspects of gender and sex, gender and sex, are also, it just makes it more complex. Doesn't take it out. It's still there. This idea of what does that sexuality mean? It complicates the question of what does that mean, because it complicates the idea of opposite sex. Not that it complicates, not that it takes away this relationship that constructs these two things. Okay, so I think that it's so okay. I'm gonna don't worry, I put a little tag in my brain. But when you think about this, okay, you see that you can go home and figure this out too. But you see how gender constructs sexuality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How do you know someone is a man?
They identify as a man and they have XY chromosomes.
There are like 7 different lenses of identity. Like one of them is like biological, and then one is like how they were raised or identified, how the outside world sees them, how they present. It's been years. It's been class on it.
There's a lot of
There's like all these lenses that construct the identity. So it's not just
A higher order of creation that has speech. Yeah. I'm thinking in the biblical sense of creating out of the mud and adding breath. And I'm a rabbi, so I was thinking of a psalm, what is man, that you have thought of it. And, there's a very higher
so
level.
you answered the question of human?
Yeah.
Right, okay. That's interesting.
Earthling.
Right. I was talking about the gender or slash sex category.
About the XY.
There's
Yeah.
also, aside from biology, I think there's a suggestion, or maybe an assumption, that man takes responsibility or has the ability to have responsibility and therefore is awarded leadership roles. And so I'm thinking in the context of a man versus a boy. So when people say, like, oh, he's a man, or be a man,
Mm-hmm.
that's implied that you need to step up and take some type of responsibility, because being a man, you're in a capacity to do that.
Yeah, and a mensch is somebody who's also ethical.
Mm-hmm.
Says So in our parlance, we would say, such a mensch, meaning he gives charity, and he not only takes responsibility, but does so in such an ethical way that he's a model for others. Can't help going there.
No.
The biology's not enough.
Right, no. Well, I mean, biology is not even useful.
Separate,
You know, it's not even useful. You know, one of the things that I talk about in my masculinities class when I'm talking about gender is that, in fact,
Class and masculinity?
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
You know, look at me. Do you think I'm a man?
Yeah. Do you think you're a man?
You're
You're answering the question with a question.
That's a good thing. That's the first question. Maybe, yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay. But you didn't even have to ask that, did you? You know, it's reasonable to make an assumption.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? You would interact with me as if I were a man unless, you know, you thought that there was a possibility that I was not, right? So how do you know I'm a man? What made you think that that was a possibility?
Beard, voice, dress, posture, bald.
Oh.
Sorry.
I'm
I
working
said
on
there's
it.
women that have beards at this point, and there's women that are bald. And there would be
You should
more
cover it up
breasts.
Okay. What I would suggest is that you know it because of my performance. Okay.
What you put out.
You know, not to be too crass about it, but you know, see students with you don't know what's in my pants.
Mm-hmm.
You don't
Yeah.
know. You have no idea. You know, as if that would make a difference. Okay. So you don't know what I have underneath my clothes. You know, even if you did know what was underneath my clothes, this wouldn't do it. Okay. There are all sorts of conditions where XY chromosomes exist in a person. The person's 46XY, okay, and we would express that we would expect that genotype to be expressed as a male body phenotype, but in fact it does not occur. Okay.
Remind us, genotype, phenotype.
Genotype is the your genome, the genetics that you have, you know, in your cells. But phenotype is the expression of those genes, and that always occurs in the context of a gene-environment interaction. And so, if a person has 46 XY, but they have a androgen insensitivity, okay, as another part of their genome, you can have complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, and your body, your phenotype would be female.
Really?
Yes. Okay. And so you would look at that person, and you would say that person is a girl baby, they're a girl child, they're a young woman. Okay. But in fact, when you examine their body in a full medical sense, you see that in fact they are not. They are not female in terms of their body structures. I think that they have testes. Yes, they have testes, but they also have an incomplete vagina. The first 1/3 of the vagina is produced differently than the gonads and the anatomies that are associated with the gonads.
Can they have children?
No.
Can they compete in the Women's Olympics?
It depends. It depends. The Olympics is a good opportunity to see publicly, this tension. They have a real hard time, finding the difference between people who are men and people who are women, because what criteria do you use? Do you use genotype? Do you use their social role? Do you use how people treat them? Do you use their performance? And people have and so those complexities, really complicate the idea of the identification of a person
So if we say that people are on a spectrum of sexuality, a spectrum of race, a spectrum of gender, a spectrum of probably every quality. So how do we use that? Because we still need to categorize people for, I don't know, for understanding or for...
And people try to make sense of...
try to make sense of the world, which
yeah.
is sort of like why we have stereotypes, which is the bad part of that, but we sort of want to make sense of the world. So how do we use this new understanding we have of a spectrum? How does that help us?
Well, I think that a spectrum is kind of, it's a stepping stone to understanding, the complexities in a more rich way, but, if you stick with it too long, like this Venn diagram, if you stick with it too long, then you start to, it starts to hinder you rather than help you. Kind of like, it's kind of like training wheels on a bike. It's like, at first it's really helpful, but eventually it starts to slow you down. So the idea of a spectrum, can slow you down because it's like you think about two sides of a continuum. Like man, woman, and then you have, a spectrum in between. Doesn't work. That's not how gender works. We know that psychologically gender works. You can think about it as multiple axes. Masculinity as an axis, femininity as an axis, and then there can be other axes that also work in that construct of gender. So
Do you think that brings in the challenge where there's this desire to classify things because it simplifies and it gives people the feeling of terra firma? They feel like, okay, this is secure because I can label it. But the reality is that life, my opinion here, as with many, it's much more fluid. That impermanence is the very thing that, whether you embrace it or you fear it, is the very thing that can define your existence of how you go through your life. So, I mean, you meet someone, I met someone just a few days ago, and he was explaining his mom, and he said, she started off as Jewish, but now she's Catholic, and she was married, she had me, and then she was gay, and now she's back to being married, and she's born again. And he was so conflicted by this whole thing, and I just said to him, well, life is fluid, and people are fluid, and we're hopefully responsive and not just reactive, and maybe your mom's embracing a responsive approach to just celebrating who she is at this moment. And he looked at me and go, it's crazy. I think it was just weird. He probably had not heard that response before. But I thought, I found myself thinking about that in the subway, and I thought, well, what brings people to these types of changes? Is that are you like that and you negate it and you deny it? Or are you just embracing different things? Or is that just a reflection of having lived your life long enough where you're ready to, be the person that you feel like you are at that given moment? Because if you look at your life as a spectrum, gosh, heaven forbid if we're the same as we started off 20, 30, 40 years ago. I can't think of anything more scary.
Or if we were thinking about sliding along, you have like an indicator, you slide along it, like the Kinsey scale, that's a disaster. That's a useful place to start really early, But what it does is it conflates behavior and identity in ways that, once you start to look at it in more detail, becomes more complicated, and less helpful than it would. But it's a good place to start because you're not thinking about people as stuck in boxes, at least,
But there are identities that are permanent. And I think once I have a child, whether my child lives or dies, living, or children, but I became a mother. That never goes away. That now becomes kind of a permanent piece of an identity, regardless of how you behave in it. Right?
Well, but what if you decided to transition and became a father? Would you?
Change your gender. Okay.
Change my gender, but the notion of parent. Okay, so maybe it's not mother, but parent is whether I have nothing to do with that child ever.
Right.
It is a piece of my history it's a piece of my identity, I may assume it or not. So
Right.
what's the tension between transient identities or permanent identities?
Well, the way I would think about it is that identities, you know, they can be stable in terms of the nut of it, the fact of it, but you know, how that relates to other parts of the self, also what that is, you know, like I was saying, you know, if Jody's example is actually a good one. If you were to transition, become, you know, to transition to be a man or a trans man, depending on how you want to identify, you still sit in relationship to your child as a mother. You know, you're a mother now who is now a male or you know, or trans or what have you, whatever that identity is. And so understanding, you know, what being a mother is, the other aspects of intersections change because there's an intersection of motherhood and gender, you know. And if you were identifying as a woman before, and now you're identifying as a man, the way in which you experience mother is transformed by that change in your gender. That's what this is about, you know. And it's not like a Lego construction where things are how do I say it, stable and static, you know, and you're connecting them, and so the difference is in the connections. That's not where it is. The difference is that the identity itself is dynamic. You know, what happens within it changes. So it's like your motherhood is like this cup, okay? But the stuff that's in it gets transformed by, you know, the other aspects of the self that are part of it.
How is this used or useful or applied? What do you do with this? I mean, once you've broken through the barriers of the cell walls here,
Yep.
And you see that everything's kind of mushy. So then what? Other
Okay,
than
I'll give
having
you-
raised consciousness.
Yep. No, it's actually really important. You know, I think first of all, it leads, you know, understanding intersectionality leads to a clearer understanding of the relations that exist between and within social groups. For example, when I think about the gay community, you know, people talk about the gay community as if it is one singular community, and when in fact it isn't. You know, there are multiple communities and there are multiple sexual identities that exist within, what we might think of as the gay community. If we were to sort of break down what people are doing when they think about that phrase, you know, they might be thinking about men, you know, who are white, who are middle class, upper middle class, who live in urban enclaves, like in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, what have you, and the sensibilities that come from, you know, the intersection of all of those identities. Okay, and then think about how people relate to the gay community in terms of thinking about the relationship to those, you know, that intersection of those sensibilities, and that would actually be not so helpful in understanding, you know, if we're talking about men in this context, sexual minority men, you know, LGB men. No, sorry, it would be GB men, GBT men. You know, when we think about, for example, these are women. You know, where do LBT women sit in that relation? LBT, yeah, that's right. You know, how can we think about differences in people's social and political identities, their needs, you know, their perspectives, and what have you. I'll give you an even better example. If you think about ethnic minority men who are also sexual minority men, one common experience, you know, I do research on sexuality research also, and I specialize in men, ethnic minority men, you know, of a variety of sexualities. And when I talk to men who are sexual minority, ethnic minority men, one of the challenges that they talk about is when they go into larger gay communities, okay, where they are in a racial minority status. They are exoticized.
Yeah, what?
Exoticized. You know,
Exoticized.
yeah.
That's a word. Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, it's one of those, you know, technical words. Like intersectionality, it always comes up, you know, with a little red line underneath it.
Try moving it.
It's like, you know, so I'm going to be blunt, you know, the African American, African Caribbean guys that I talk to always have, you know, white guys come to them and say, I want, our challenge is, do you want me for me, or do you want me because, you know, you think I have a big black dick? You know, what, I teach a sex class. You know, what's that, you know, and for you know, men who are in that position, they feel as if, you know, they're being placed on a pedestal, you know, they are not being seen for who they are, you know, whether they have one or not have one, you know, it's like, you know, if they don't, then, you know, then they have to, you know, then they're rejected because, well, they don't play into the fantasy of the other person, you know. You know, this, when I think about, you know, in terms of the public health aspects, Latino men, you know, have high rates of HIV. And one of the reasons why that might be the case is that the tensions of being a man in Latino cultures, and, you know, emphasis on family and childbearing and a particular sense of masculinity that is constructed, you know, in the relation between men and women, you know, leads to a sense of loss of self, you know, that when you try to connect in larger, you know, white gay communities, that, you know, because of, you know, maybe not being of the same social class, you know, and so not having, you know, the kind of power in, you know, within that influence within a relationship. If you're the poor person that comes to a relationship that is, you know, where your boyfriend is very wealthy, then, you know, who has the influence, who has the power in that relationship? And if you're exoticized on top of that, you know, then, you know, the gap between who you know, would like to be as a person and how you're experiencing the world leads to a sense of emptiness. And so, you know, one of the ways in which that gets dealt with in a short-term or long-term sense is through substance use. You know, you get high. You know, if you're always being talked about as as a toy, boy toy, then, and that bothers you, you know, but you like sex, you go out and you drink, and then you don't really care anymore. You know, and if you are, you know, in a subordinate status, you know, if your friend who, you know, is not your boyfriend, you know, not in a relationship, he says, you know, let's bareback tonight. You know, let's have sex without a condom. You know, and you're going to be the receptive partner. You know, it becomes a little bit more difficult to have that conversation in terms of, you know, being empowered to have the conversation if you lose on so many levels. You know, you don't have, you know, a good relationship. You don't have a relationship with a guy who, you know, if you can't pay your rent, you know, and all of these things have led, you know, are implicated in higher HIV rates for Latino men.
Sounds like objectification more than you know, making someone else an I-it instead of an I-thou relationship.
It is objectification, you know, but it's a particular kind of objectification. You know, it's you know, it's not, I'm going to objectify you as a sex object. I'm going to objectify you as a particular flavor of sex object. You know, with a certain set of expectations. You know.
So what is, you know, we're talking about kind of practical implications.
Yeah.
What is the, you know, does this drive policy issues? Does this drive educational issues? You know, and at what age?
all the way through. You know,
And this is about creating communities of kind of various, of various identifications.
I can give you another example. If we think about blackness and connect it to being a low social class status, okay, working class or living in poverty, and that's something that's a way a lot of people construct blackness. The idea of keeping it real becomes the idea of keeping those lower middle class, those lower class or working class attributes as a part of blackness. So I talk about something that I have experienced, but a lot of people have that experience. Usually around class. So when white people experience it, it's around social class also. But it's a little bit different here. So when I was growing up, I started school early. I skipped a grade, and so by the time I was in 5th grade, I was about 2 years younger than the kids around me, and I was really athletic. But I also had a lot of friends in my neighborhood. One day, one of the other kids from my neighborhood, who was also black, came into my class. Teacher. He was darker than I was. He was, I was a very shy kid. He was very boisterous. And the teacher said, at one point, why can't you be like Linwood? Okay. And so he didn't really notice before that, I was really good at school. But afterwards, that sort of sensitized him to that. And he was also getting, a lot of negative attention from the teachers because even though we were both black, I was good black, and he was the bad black kid, And so he went back and told all of the friends in my neighborhood, and for 3 years, I had dodged these guys who were my former friends. I had dodged them as they were trying to kick my butt, And they, sometimes they would grab me and I would fight and then I'd run. Sometimes I would, it wouldn't be a fight at all. Sometimes they'd just mock me, say, oh, well, you're just acting white, because, and that's the key, acting white, gets associated with, for these kids, with, being interested in education, which is something that is tougher for people who, who are of, working class or lower status. That's one of the ways in which social class is signaled by educational attainment, And so there was that confusion that existed because of this intersection of race and social class that was not conscious to any of us. Okay? Afterwards, when we started, when we got older, we started to disentangle it. But by then, these guys had left school. I had, it's hard to talk about, I had, for a little bit, almost left blackness, And that's something that a lot of high-achieving people of color experience, a loss of ethnic identity because of rejection of people, of your family and friends because they feel that you are not keeping it real, that you are not living up to, this entangled sense of social class that gets entangled with race.
What about a whole middle and upper middle class people of color? Isn't there upward mobility? Isn't there a chance through education to change your status and still stay very much rooted?
Look at me and a lot of other people. But the thing is that the tension is, there's a tension there that you have to negotiate. It's like how, blackness is not in the end just about, being, poor, but that's the way in which a lot of people, conceive of it.
Would you say that's why people want to go back to Africa and find their
That's different. That's different.
But you see that desire, especially at that young age, to identify difference, right? I mean, I have twins.
Yeah.
2 boys, and one of my twins is an athlete, and I've got 3 boys actually, but one of the twins just sits and reads all day, giant books, and the other twin is the sports kid, and they've self-identified. They have put these, I have not done this to them, they've done this to themselves, and in doing that, one will say, well, you're nerdy. I'm like, where did that come from? Where did that desire to call your brother nerd from society.
Right.
He simply enjoys reading, and you enjoy sports.
Right.
And you have done this to yourself.
And then what happens is that within the, within nerd culture, people mock jocks, and so, when my friends would say, so you're a jock, right? Because, I was really good at sports, and they're, it's like, well, you must be dumb, and it's like, and it was very interesting, so, I played more non-traditional sports, played ultimate frisbee, and still I got some of that same, it's interesting how you start to.
So this question of where does intersectionality meet in with societal expectations?
Right. I mean,
where's the intervention? Where do you, in those examples, where do you intervene to say, well, there's actually a more fluid experience with that, or the example of the boy toy, there's a two-prong. You have to address this fantasy world and
right.
why is that being constructed, and then also address the the emptiness of disconnect between how
right.
I'm seeing myself as this person, this other person is seeing me this way. How do you?
I think in each place, if you're going to intervene, it has to be an intervention about, first of all, shedding light on it. So it was very helpful. Those boys that ostracized me, eventually, we got back together and they said they were sorry for the things that they had done.
Wow. What a healing.
It was. But the thing is also that 3 of the 5 kids that were the ringleaders are dead.
Wow.
HIV, drug abuse, and drug violence. And the thing is that the loss of those guys, in fact, I traced directly to that experience that this one buddy of mine was having in 5th grade, where the teacher said, well, you have these characteristics, so I'm going to reject you. Instead of thinking about, well, social class differences, between pupils, this is what I teach my art of teaching students. I say, you got to understand that, social class differences in terms of how people interact within the classroom, and also your own expectations of how, kids of color should act and would act in a classroom affect how you interact with your students, and you have to stop that. You have to own it and teach students in ways that are equal. Yeah.
Also boys. How do you teach
boys?
How
Right.
do you teach boisterous boys?
Right. Why do boys get a pass? Boisterous boys, people think about it as being an inherent part of their nature, and part of their nature that needs to be either reined in or
Drugged.
or drugged, exactly, or moved to the classroom, suspended. So in that way, the intervention, I would suggest is, and on the other side, I would say the intervention is realizing that there are lots of different ways that you can be a part of your community and not do exactly what, this connection between lower social class status and race is, I have to tell you, I think it is a internalization, in this case, of racism. You've internalized, the ways in which other people have denigrated you, and think that the only thing that you have is, you cannot have education. Education is not yours, And so, I think that's the way in which you have to fight it, and it's a hard fight.
But isn't there an innate yearning and motivation to improve and to learn and to rise and to better? I mean, isn't that something that we all want, no matter what class, what race, what gender?
But the thing is that,
I don't say it's
actually, I would agree with you about the innate part, whatever that means. But the thing is that it's not supported in the world.
To be indoctrinated just based on what other people, the labels, at a very young age. And so I think you asked about how does this apply to real life. I mean, every time you check off some form where it says check 1 or check all that apply, and now it's which do you relate to or identify with most, and or you have pollers call you and they say, well, are you Caucasian or are you Asian? Which do you identify with more? I mean, you obviously have to create a dialogue, and I understand and appreciate you want to get numbers and figures, and you're trying to assess what that spectrum is. But it's like, I feel that the more that we constantly allow this and encourage this and accept this as normal, it's just calcifying this labeling of people and ideas, and it just, you're just basically giving it a pass and saying it's okay. And that's why every time I do this, I'm just the jerk that checks every box, or I will just check other, or I will say to them, like, why is this necessary? What does it matter what my ethnic background is? If you want my opinion, if you want to know who I'm going to vote for, I'm independent. I mean, pollers hate me, and I'm fine with that.
Well, I think that it's not so much the label, because people, other folks have said it and have come to different conclusions.
Yeah.
So it's like in France, for example, you are not allowed to collect ethnic, or racial data. It's something that is not allowed according to the French Constitution. So they have no idea who's living in the banlieues outside of Paris.
Until they bow down in the streets and close off the streets for prayer.
Or there's a riot because you've been treating people unfairly, and you have no way of seeing the level of unfairness you've been.
Which just shows that there's a good point and a bad point to anything.
Right. And in the United States, when we collect that information, the bad part is that people use the labels in order to put people into categories and put things on top of it. But it's not the understanding of and the collection of the data itself. That's why when we look at what happens in California and there are various movements, mostly among conservative folks, to stop collecting racial and ethnic information, in terms of what happens in public life, And the argument is a similar argument, but the reason why they're doing it is not, for the reasons that you're suggesting. The reason why is because if that information does not exist, then you cannot apply any of the remedies for social inequalities that exist. Affirmative action is meaningless then. Voter rights, the Voting Rights Acts and all of the different remedies around that are meaningless. You can't.
That's the positive application.
Right, because there's no information.
I just have to say that formally it's past 11 o'clock, so there's nothing in the schedule until 11:30, but I did want to just alert everybody.
I was thinking that,
we're welcome to sit if Linwood wants to sit, but I just want, lunch starts at 11:30, so you have until then.
So,
I was just thinking about this idea of remedies. It's so interesting because, when we think about how we interact with other people, this sort of taking them as who they are and who they present themselves as is beneficial, and I think it's really helpful for thinking about public health policy and the way we construct outreach, education, all these things. But, in the legal context, you also want to construct a precedent that's going to be beneficial to as many people as possible. So intersectionality comes into play because a lot of legal scholars that can really crunch on these other women were like, okay, I'm harmed because I'm black, but I'm also harmed because I'm a woman. And so how do we kind of deal with those multiple disadvantages that someone experiences in the legal system? But at the same time, that's not enough to look at these couple of convergences and the much kind of like broader identifying of people on multiple scales is obviously preferable. But like how do you then, like you said, create remedies for patterns of social harm that do signify racial indicators or socioeconomic indicators and kind of reproduce inequalities in that way.
And the hidden costs that are found within one that you don't realize are because of other aspects of the self. Like when we think about ethnicity, we don't think about how we do, but we don't. How social class is correlated with that, but is not the same. So that when we talk about public policy as being dimensional, when we need to think about it as multidimensional. So when people talk about, well, we have to get rid of racial and ethnic preferences and only pay attention to socioeconomic ones, in some ways that works okay. But because of the strong correlation between the two. But what actually happens is that the correlation does not account for all of the inequalities that are associated specifically and only around race. So only dealing with socioeconomic status, because I hear that a lot, not here but outside, doesn't deal with the problem. It's hidden but not hidden in terms of remedies. So I think that when we think complexly and intersectionally, it helps us not only to make sense of that complex world in which we live in, but also helps us to make sense of the places in ourselves where we recapitulate inequality. When I think about the Black Power movement, and which was largely dominated by men, and men would say, I'm going to fight the power for all of us, and then turn to the women around and say, babe, go make me some coffee while I fight the power. And for some men, the reification and the desire to recapitulate patriarchal relationships, that were found within majority culture in minority, in blackface or in brown face, and that's something that can be combated if we think intersectionally in ourselves also. So,
Thank you.
Just a taste.
Thank you very, very much.
So, see you tonight at dinner, I guess.
Your visual name on your